All right, so here's the story of how I, Frank, went from shelter scraps to the gourmet dining life in Brooklyn. And before you ask, yes, the name's Frank, but not because I'm particularly frank in personality. I got the name at the shelter, though between us, I'd have chosen something with a bit more edge. But hey, when you're a wrinkly bulldog with teeth that don't exactly line up, you don't get many privileges. Frank it was, and I wore it like a champ. The shelter was, how do I put it delicately? A mixed bag. A whole orchestra of sounds and smells, with everyone singing off-key and not a single conductor in sight. Dogs yapping, cats meowing, birds, I don't know, squawking. I didn't listen to them much. And the people. Oh, the people. Always with that strange smell of wet mop and oversprayed cologne. My days felt like one long, monotonous stretch of concrete floors, bowls of flavorless kibble, and endless rounds of, oh, look at his face, from humans who clearly didn't have the decency to consider that, yes, I had seen my face before, and I wasn't that impressed either. But the worst part? Saying goodbye to all the friends I made. For instance, there was Max, a sassy terrier who could squeeze himself under any gate in about 2 seconds flat. He'd make nightly rounds, his version of a motivational pep talk to each of us in our cages, giving everyone the latest gossip about which dog was getting out next. Or Penny, an older beagle who had this strange love of grooming everyone's ears. She'd always make us promise we'd never forget her. Of course, I wouldn't forget her. She slobbered in my ear every morning. And then came the day when it was my turn to leave. When the shelter staff announced my departure, I felt this huge swirl of emotions. Excited? A bit, yeah. Nervous? Definitely. It was strange, you know. You grow kind of attached to a place, even if it's a shelter. You miss the familiar smells, the grating voices of your neighbors, the way Max would poke his nose through my gate every morning just to check if I was still snoring. As they led me out, I threw one last look over my shoulder. Maybe I was hoping Max would tunnel his way over and escape with me, or Penny would, you know, howl out a goodbye. But it was just me, padding down that long, cold hallway toward the bright light of the outside world. Let me tell you, when I first met Henry, I wasn't exactly impressed. There he stood, this tall, lanky human with a wrinkled shirt, and an expression that looked like he hadn't quite decided if he was terrified or excited. For a second, I almost turned around and went back to the shelter. He seemed nervous, kept fumbling with his hands and glancing at me like I was a bomb about to go off. But then he crouched down and gave me one of those ridiculous baby talk greetings. Hey there, buddy. Who's a good boy? Oh, great. Another one of those. I was used to people thinking they had to act like clowns around us dogs. I gave him my best, "Are you serious?" look, but he just laughed. And maybe it was his laugh, kind of quiet, a little rusty, that made me pause. You see, we shelter dogs get a sense for people. Most of us can read humans better than they can read us. And as he reached out, still talking in that high-pitched tone that made me roll my eyes, I caught a whiff of something familiar. Loneliness. I'd smelled it a million times before, on all kinds of humans who'd come and gone from the shelter, but Henry wore it like a faded jacket. I couldn't help but give him a little sniff, you know, just to see if I was right. Turns out I was. Now, this might come as a surprise, but bulldogs aren't exactly built for joyrides. So, when Henry loaded me into his car and we hit the road, I wasn't thrilled. The car smelled like stale coffee and takeout containers. This guy wasn't exactly a neat freak. As he fumbled to get my seatbelt on, yes, he actually put a seatbelt on me, I decided I'd just tolerate it for the sake of whatever this was. Henry kept glancing over at me every 5 seconds, probably worried I'd bolt out the window or something, as if I had the energy for that. After a few blocks of this awkward silence, he tried to make conversation. So, Frank, that's your name, right? Frank? I gave him a sidelong look. Yes, it's Frank, genius. You only signed the adoption papers with my name on them about 12 times. Of course, he couldn't hear my inner sarcasm, but I felt better knowing it was there. And then, in a surprising move, he reached out and gave me a gentle pat on the head. I froze for a second, but he didn't push it. He just went back to driving, humming a song that I recognized from the shelter's radio, the kind of upbeat tune humans use to drown out whatever they're really feeling. I settled back in my seat, and somewhere between the potholes and Henry's off-key singing, I started to think that maybe, just maybe, this wouldn't be so bad. Life in Brooklyn was a whole new experience. For one thing, it's loud, really loud. And no one tells you about the smells. Every single corner, stoop, and sidewalk square seemed to have its own unique aroma. Pizza, garbage, stale beer, and the occasional whiff of something I think was a hot dog. But I wasn't about to test that theory. Henry's apartment was on the third floor of a building with narrow staircases that weren't exactly Bulldog friendly. By the time we climbed to the top, I was wheezing like I'd just run a marathon. Henry gave me a sympathetic look, muttering something about going easy on the treats. Yeah, sure, blame it on me. I'd been in his house for exactly 10 minutes and already caught a glimpse of a whole cupboard full of snacks. Hypocrite. The apartment itself was cozy, if a bit messy. There was a big, old couch with just enough space under it for me to hide my favorite chew toy, once I found one, and Henry had a bed that, I'm pleased to report, was just as soft as it looked. I made a mental note to claim my corner of it before he decided to set boundaries. Spoiler alert, that plan worked perfectly. The first night was a little strange. I lay on my blanket by Henry's bed, watching as he snored lightly, shifting every few minutes like he was having some kind of dream marathon. It was comforting, in a weird way, to know that he was there. In the shelter, I'd always slept with an ear out, waiting for the next loud noise or restless dog nearby. Here with Henry, it was quiet. As the days went on, I started to settle in. Henry had this routine that I quickly picked up on. Every morning he'd shuffle out of bed, mumbling to himself about the joys of office life, then stumble into the kitchen for coffee. This was usually my cue to whine until he remembered to fill my bowl. If there's one thing about humans I'll never understand, it's how they can function without food first thing in the morning. I mean, they're slow enough as it is. Imagine skipping breakfast. Henry and I developed a bit of a ritual. He'd pour himself a bowl of cereal, pour me a bowl of kibble, and we'd sit across from each other, munching away. Sometimes he'd talk to me, rambling about his day or telling me about his latest work drama. And yes, I pretended to listen, giving him my best wise bulldog look, even if I was just mentally cataloguing the snacks I'd hidden around the apartment. One day, while Henry was in the middle of some rant about office politics, he stopped and looked at me. You know, Frank, you're a pretty good listener. Well, obviously. It's not like I had a choice. But there was something about the way he said it that made me realize just how much this guy needed someone to talk to. So I became Henry's confidant. Every night after he'd come back from work, we'd go through the same routine. First, the door would swing open, and he'd mutter some half-hearted greeting to me. Hey Frank, I'm home. I'd wag my tail, even though, let's be honest, I'd rather he came in with a snack in hand. Maybe a nice chewy bone to show he appreciated my patience. But hey, no one's perfect. Henry would settle on the couch, and I'd jump up next to him, pretending not to care about the smell of whatever sad dinner he had picked up on the way. Sometimes he'd offer me a tiny taste, which was better than the kibble he'd bought for me. And then, like clockwork, he'd start talking. Here's a secret about humans. They love to tell you everything, but they don't expect you to say much back. A perfect situation for a bulldog like me. Henry would go on and on about office meetings, spreadsheets, Steve from accounting, and something called quarterly reports. I didn't understand half of it, but I'd nod my head now and then, and he'd look at me like I was the smartest thing on 4 legs. The truth? I was just thinking about when I'd get my next snack. Somewhere in between the stories, though, I realized that Henry and I were actually becoming friends. It wasn't all about the treats or the comfy bed anymore. I started to look forward to our evenings. There was something comforting in his voice, even when he was complaining about how everyone's incompetent. I'd lie there with my head on his lap, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing, and let myself drift into the warmth of our little routine. One weekend, Henry decided it was time for a big adventure. Now, as a bulldog, I'm not one for big adventures. I'm more of a let's nap and maybe go for a slow walk kind of guy. But Henry was insistent, so off we went to the park. We arrived at this place called Prospect Park. Let me tell you, it was a spectacle. Dogs of all sizes, colors and shapes everywhere. As soon as we stepped in, a particularly enthusiastic Labrador bounded over and started sniffing me like I was some new exotic treat. I gave him my best grumpy look, but he kept circling me, wagging his tail like we were best friends already. Typical Labrador. No boundaries. Henry laughed, which made me feel a little less irritated, and we found a nice spot by a shady tree where he could sit, and I could observe the chaos around us. Every now and then, a kid would run by, their hands sticky with some kind of sugary mess, and Henry would reach down and ruffle my ears. "Good boy, Frank," he'd say, like I'd just saved him from a robbery. After a while, we started walking around, and I realized that Henry was actually pretty good at picking up on my cues. Whenever I got tired, he'd stop and let me rest. And when I spotted a squirrel, a rare but thrilling sight, he even let me give a half-hearted chase. I'm not built for speed, but for those glorious 2 seconds, I was a hunting dog. We went home that day with grass stains, droopy eyes, and something new between us. Maybe it was all those shared glances or the quiet understanding we had when he'd stop and wait for me to catch my breath. Whatever it was, it felt good, like we were really becoming a team. One night, Henry came home, and I could tell right away that something was wrong. He didn't say hello, didn't flop onto the couch like he usually did. Instead, he went straight to his bedroom and closed the door. This was weird, even for Henry. I sat outside, staring at that door, listening to his muffled voice on the phone, the sound of him sighing. After what felt like hours, he finally came out. His face looked tired, sad even. He sank down onto the couch, not even looking at me, just staring off into space. I nudged his hand with my nose, but he didn't respond. So I did the only thing I could think of. I climbed up next to him, all 90 pounds of me, and plopped my head right on his lap. For a long time, he just sat there, running his fingers through my fur. He didn't say much, and I didn't need him to. Sometimes, humans just need you to be there. And as I lay there, feeling the weight of his hand on my back, I realized that this was why I'd come home with him from the shelter. Not for the treats or the comfy bed, not even for the half-chewed tennis ball he'd brought home one day as a gift. Clearly not a connoisseur in dog toys. No, I was here for this. For him. After that night, things changed between us. Henry seemed lighter somehow, like he'd let go of some invisible weight. He still had his bad days, of course. Humans seem to have a lot of those. But he started to smile more, even when I'd leave a slobbery mess on the couch or accidentally steal his spot on the bed. We found a rhythm, Henry and I. Weekdays were for routines, evenings were for sharing snacks and stories, and weekends. Those were ours for exploring the world, even if exploring meant we'd just go to the local park or sit on the stoop, watching people walk by. I started to notice how the people around us would smile when they saw us together. Some of them would say, "Oh, look at that Bulldog, what a cutie." And Henry would laugh, giving me a scratch behind the ears and muttering, "Yeah, he's a heartbreaker, all right." And for once, I didn't mind the attention. It felt good, like I was finally where I was meant to be. A year passed, then another. My face grew a little grayer, my joints a bit stiffer. But Henry and I, we were a team. I'd follow him anywhere, whether it was to the little coffee shop on the corner where the barista would sneak me a biscuit, or to the park for our Saturday strolls. Life wasn't flashy or filled with wild adventures, but it was ours, and that was enough. One evening, as we lay on the couch, Henry looked at me and said, "You know, Frank, I don't know what I'd do without you." I gave him a look that said, "Obviously." But I knew what he meant. He'd given me a second chance, a place to call home. And in return, I'd given him my loyalty, my patience, and all the slobbery kisses I could muster. Now, as I sit here, watching Henry fumble with his laptop and complain about new software updates, whatever that means, I can't help but feel a swell of pride. I might be a dog, just a wrinkly, grumpy bulldog who snorts more than he barks, but I found my place in the world. And more importantly, I found my person. For all those dogs still waiting in the shelter, I hope they find their Henry too. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that everyone deserves a friend who understands them, a warm bed to sleep in, and the chance to just be themselves. And to Henry, well, I'll be here as long as he needs me, snoring on the couch and pretending not to listen to his endless stories. After all, that's what friends are for, isn't it?